It's time for us to go and take a look at the Blackberry Passport and see how this specific phone holds up in 2023. Now, this is one of those phones that's very, very interesting because I don't really think this is a phone that anybody should be buying anymore, but this was a pretty good concept from Blackberry, and although they are not really around as a company anymore, one thing we have to kind of be honest with is that they did take a lot of chances when they probably didn't even have to. So it is kind of interesting when it comes down to it. But, all in all, I probably wouldn't recommend buying a Blackberry Passport anymore. You are much better off buying something like a phone that is still supported with software, things like a Galaxy S20 or newer, or a Google Pixel 4, even a Google Pixel 5 or newer. Those would be way better options. But I will leave those types of phones linked down in the description. You can get them from there, and you can help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the outside of the Blackberry Passport, this is probably the most unique designed phone that came out probably in the last decade. If I'm going to be honest, a phone that is probably, and not necessarily the best way possible, but a phone that definitely would stand out if you're showing somebody like 4 or 5 different phones, and this was one of them. This is probably going to be one of the phones they're going to be remembering, if I'm being honest. So on the front, you had basically a little bit of bezel. So clearly there's a little bit of top bezel, which is okay. You had the display, which was a 4.5-inch IPS LCD panel, which honestly doesn't really look that bad of a display either, which is pretty interesting. But then you had that massive keyboard on the bottom. So this is where things are starting to take a little bit of a turn. So remember that this phone came out in 2014. Okay, this is not, the phone that came out in 2009. It came out in 2014. Some of the phones that we got that year include, I believe we had the Galaxy S3 that came out, or the Galaxy S4 that came out that year. We had the iPhone 6 that came out that year. We had a lot of phones that came out this year. Maybe it was the Galaxy S5 that came out this year too. I think we had the Nexus that came out this year. There were lots of phones that came out in 2014. And with this phone, it was pretty much kind of competing with those ones. It wasn't a cheap, Blackberry by any means. So that is, another thing to keep in mind. So the design was either the make it or break it for you. Either you were buying this phone because of its design or you weren't. But also, this was a squared phone. This was like a phone that was pretty much a square at that point, and the aspect ratio of that screen was very different. That time we had, although we weren't even getting like bezel-less phones during that time, we were still getting phones that had pretty normal aspect ratios from one generation to the other. If you're going from like a Galaxy S5 to an iPhone 6, the screen is going to be kind of the same in terms of like the, screen size and the way you're going to hold the phone. The Blackberry Passport was a completely different story. So that's another big thing to keep in mind here. Like there's just big thing after big thing. Now on the bottom, we had our micro USB port, which is great. We had a headphone jack on this phone. We also had a micro SD card slot, which is very interesting. I kind of forget that Blackberry for many generations kept that micro SD card slot on their phone. So this was no exception, and that was a really cool thing they kind of had going for this specific device as well. Now moving on to the back, we had a little bit of a, we had a camera setup up top, which was nice. We didn't really have too many other crazy things going on with this phone on the back, but it's still nice that we did have a little bit of that plastic bag. And, by this point, a lot of phones were already moving to way better feeling bodies. So it already kind of felt like an outdated phone, but I guess it's understandable. Like, the design and everything, BlackBerry had to cut some costs after making the keyboard here, I guess. So it didn't really feel like the most premium thing, but it definitely looked very unique. And that kind of covers it up how it looked like on the outside. Now, moving on to the camera setup, this thing on the back had a 13 megapixel standard camera, and on the front it had a 2 megapixel camera. Now, to be honest, if, kind of looking back, this phone is almost 10 years old. It's basically like 9 and some change years old right now. And every camera that's approaching this year, it's going to be old. It's going to be not good. Cameras have gone a long way since 2014. So every camera that we look at from 2014 is not going to be that great. But comparing it to other phones that came out in 2014, things like the iPhone 6 and the Samsung Galaxy of that year, whether it was the Galaxy 4 or Galaxy S5, if I'm going to be honest, you're definitely still going to be getting a better experience on the Galaxy S5, Galaxy S4, or the iPhone 6 than you would be getting on this phone. So, although that specific phone wasn't like, the Blackberry Passport wasn't a horrible phone, you are still getting a better experience on something like, the iPhone or the Galaxy of that year than the Blackberry Passport. Now, you can film 1080p video on the back, you can film 1080p video on the front, and that's kind of it. There wasn't really a crazy amount of features built in within, inside of these cameras anyway. That's kind of another thing to keep in mind. So it's kind of one thing after another, but in this specific case, it really wasn't that great of a camera experience for the most part, but I'm sure some people liked it expensive back then. Now, in terms of software, this was another thing that people honestly either, loved it or they hated it. I remember so many times back in like 2010 through probably 2013, there were a lot of people that still liked BlackBerry and they were using their BlackBerry phone all of the time. And it was mostly because of BlackBerry Messenger and probably the software associated with BlackBerry in general as well. And it wasn't until iOS and Android started taking it up a notch that BlackBerry felt some type of way, and they eventually switched away from what they were doing with their like BlackBerry operating system and did more of like a stock Android kind of approach. But I think by then it was too late. And in this case with the BlackBerry Passport, I really don't know what they were trying to do here. I don't really like BlackBerry software that much. And yeah, again, you're probably getting a much better experience with Android now. Now, I think this thing is built on Android, so you can still install APK files, which is nice. But even that was still a workaround. And because of the way the aspect ratio is of the display, it just really didn't perform that. Like, I didn't really like that square design. A lot of applications were kind of spread out, and it just really wasn't that great of an experience there. I think it was an interesting approach they did here, but I don't really think they thought too ahead of that squared off design, if I'm being honest. So, that kind of touches on that as well. Now, pretty much hitting on the performance, luckily for us, this phone at that time really wasn't that bad of a performing phone. It had that Qualcomm Snapdragon 801 chipset inside with 3GB of RAM. Now, there were lots of phones that came out in 2014 that still didn't have 3GB of RAM. Case in point, the iPhone 6 and iPhone 6 Plus both had 1GB of RAM. So this thing was definitely not the slowest performing phone, and I will definitely say it was a good performing phone when it first came out. And that's kind of one thing that's always kind of interesting to me, is that BlackBerry uses pretty decent hardware, but the software and the experience just really isn't always that great for me. And this case was no exception. So with something like the BlackBerry Passport, you're not getting a good performing phone anymore. It's kind of obvious. This phone is a fairly older phone. And when you are getting an older phone like this, it's definitely not going to be that fast. It's definitely not going to be giving you that great of an experience. And that is kind of expected. So with something like the BlackBerry Passport, you should expect to be pretty much getting like a very basic type of performing phone. And again, that's kind of expected. But if you do take it up a notch, and if you are trying to play heavy intensive games as to this point, it's definitely not going to be that great. But if we were to go back to 2014, I'm sure this phone was actually a pretty decent performing phone. It probably wasn't that slow, and I'm sure a lot of people actually enjoyed it. So it is very, very interesting how technology just advances so fast. And I'm sure by the time 2016 or 2017 rolled around, this phone was already a very old and maybe even a very slow phone. But it's funny because this phone isn't slow. It's just the whole entire clunkiness of the software just makes it a very awkward experience for me. And especially, we're kind of used to Android and iOS, and even like Auction OS, I complain about Auction OS a lot now, and that's skinned. But it makes, the BlackBerry OS, the BlackBerry OS was very, very skin on top of it. So that kind of covers it up there. And to be completely honest, I definitely don't think the BlackBerry Passport is worth buying anymore, which is quite obvious. This thing hasn't even gotten a software update in so long. The company of BlackBerry, the BlackBerry company, I think has gone out too, so it's like not even relevant anymore. So it's just like so much weirdness going on with this phone. But it was a good concept, and I do appreciate when companies take chances. And so we can't overlook that BlackBerry did go through and try to, I wouldn't say they took a chance, they just didn't change. Because they kept the keyboard. They've always had the keyboard. They've already had everything. Even their BlackBerry Priv that I loved a lot, that thing had a keyboard too. So I think they were banking on people never upgrading keyboards, and people did. And BlackBerry never really changed. And by the time they did, it was a little too late. But I think they did an okay job with the BlackBerry Passport. If you liked it, then you loved it. But, I really don't know too many people that even use this phone at all. So that pretty much covers it up. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.